Here I'm going to make a light refreshing beer. The method I'm using is extract brewing. Here I'm using liquid malt extract. This is going to be a very light beer at just over 3% alcohol by volume. So I'm using 1.5 kilograms of light liquid malt extract. If you were using a dry malt extract, you would use 1.3 kilos in its place. As I'm using the liquid malt extract, I'm going to soften the contents of the can by standing it in hot water for around 20 minutes. Whilst I'm doing that, I'm going to weigh out the additional ingredients which are going to add colour and flavour to the finished beer. Here I've got 100 grams of torrefied wheat and 100 grams of crushed crystal malt. These I'm adding straight to my saucepan. I've got a 10 litre saucepan here. You could always, to make it easier for yourself, put the grain into a grain bag or tie them in some muslin cloth. Once the contents of this can has softened, I'm going to add it to our saucepan. There'll be still some malt extract clinging to the sides of the tin, so I'm just going to fill the tin with water from a boiled kettle. I'll do this a couple of times, and the temperature of the water I want in my saucepan, I'm aiming for around 65 degrees C, which is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'll make up the volume with both boiling and cold water to try and get this temperature right. I can obviously add heat from the hob just to keep this temperature for the length of time I'm steeping the grains. The volume of liquid I've got here is about 6 litres, which is quite a small volume considering the end yield of this brew will be 15 litres. A lot of people will argue to use a closer volume here to your end volume for better quality, and by all means do that. However, I am using a low volume here because I'm pushed for time. The smaller volume will be much quicker for me to heat up when I want to boil the wort with the hops, and also it'll be much quicker for me to cool it down before I'm pitching in the yeast. So after the grains have been steeping here with the in the sugary liquid that we're calling wort, I'm going to strain off the wort from the grains. Obviously, if you'd used a grain bag, all you need to do is just remove it at this point, but here I'm pouring it through a sieve, and then to get out any of the sugars which may be clinging to the grains, I'm going to rinse them with water from a recently boiled kettle. You're looking for a temperature of around about 70 degrees C, which is about 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we get our saucepan back on the heat, and when the wort is boiling, we're going to add our hops. Here we're adding 30 grams of Saaz hops, which will boil in the wort for about an hour. To help the clarity of the end beer, about half an hour into this boil, I'm going to hydrate some Irish moss, which will help coagulate the proteins, and then they will drop out of suspension. Instead of Irish moss, you could use a proprietary product like Protofloc or Whirlafloc, and these I don't believe need hydrating, so you can just add those later on. So instead of doing it at the half an hour point, you can do it at the 3/4 of an hour point, because you want to be adding these around about 15 to 10 minutes before the end of your boil. At the end of the boil, it's time to hydrate our lager yeast. Here I'm using a Brew lager yeast. As far as hydrating it, I would follow the directions on the pack of yeast you've got. Some indeed won't need hydrating, they can just be added to the wort. Here I'm hydrating this in 100 ml of water, which is lukewarm. We're looking around about 30 degrees C. Here it's 28 degrees, but that's near enough for me. So whilst the yeast is hydrating, it's time for me to cool down the wort. If I'd used a larger volume of wort here, it would take me longer to cool down, and I would need to cool it right down to my pitching temperature. Here I only need to cool it down close to the pitching temperature, because I'm going to make up the volume with cold water, which will obviously further cool down the wort. So here my method of cooling, very straightforward, is just to immerse the saucepan in some cold running water continually stirring as I do so. One thing I'll add here is that it's very important now, post-boil, that everything which is going to come into contact with the beer or the wort is sterilised or sanitised, whatever you like to call it. Because up to now it's been fine to have everything just fairly scrupulously clean, because obviously the boiling process is going to kill off lots of nasty bugs. So now that the wort is cooled down, I'm going to pour it through a sieve into my fermenting bin, which has been sanitised, make it up to the volume with cold water. The pitching temperature is spot on 70 degrees C, that'll be fine for me. So I stir up the hydrated yeast, pitch it in, and now give a very vigorous stirring to the wort to aerate it, give the yeast its best possible start. So all I need to do now is place the lid on the fermenter and transfer it to a place with a stable temperature, relatively cool because it's a lager yeast we're using here. I'm fermenting away at around 70 degrees C, which is somewhere around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'll leave it there for a week or two to ferment out.